first item that we're going to refer back to now is to Liz McSkeane, who's going to talk to us, not for the half an hour on the agenda, but for slightly less time, on initial assessment, purpose and practice. So we'll welcome Liz.
Well, hello everybody, and I'm not going to spend very long on this because I think you've done an awful lot of work already on the practicalities of initial assessment yesterday, and the hosts are going to be represented in a few minutes. Afterwards, they're going to give a detailed presentation on the practicalities. So really all I want to do now is to spend the next few minutes recapping and maybe identifying some of the major themes that occurred to me listening to the discussions yesterday and the presentations yesterday and today on the very practical and nitty-gritty aspects of initial assessment, to lay the ground for the next part that Siobhan and Sheila are going to go into more detail in the next half hour. So one of the things that occurred to me was the whole idea of thinking again about what is initial assessment, because it seemed to me that it can mean so many different things, that while Janet was talking about the first step of the learning journey as being diagnosing of needs and setting goals, although it is a first step, it's quite a broad step. And I think that both Kieran and Francis and Pat from Dublin City showed that at that initial assessment stage, there's not just one thing happening, there's quite a lot of things going on at the same time. And I found a summary of, it seemed to me that the idea of initial assessment is very much tied in with the purposes of assessment. What do we assess for? And I found a very nice little summary of the purposes of assessment in the Scottish curriculum framework, and I'm not promoting it for any nationalistic reasons. I just happened to come across this, and I thought that this, for me, it kind of put it in perspective. And some of these functions seem to me to fit very well into the idea of initial assessment, and some of them less so. So the idea of initial assessment as being an alerting process. So that's not about finding out what exactly is the issue, but is there an issue at all? And Janet mentioned, for example, the health workers in Norway who noticed, they were alerted to a difficulty that people were having in an informal way because people weren't able to manage documentation. Now, of course, those alerting tools can be set up, and indeed they are. So you can see that that's one kind of thing that you would do, that you do, that is much less complex, but nevertheless it reveals something very important, i.e. that there is further investigation needed here. So then there's the placing, which is, it could be for placing in a course, it could be for placing in one-to-one or group work, all of the decisions that you make, what kind of programme, and obviously that needs to be more detailed, and the kind of things that you would do. And again, I think very well described, I know in some of your groups yesterday, very fascinatingly described by Kieran, which was indicated by the popularity of his documentation, which is literally flying off the shelves. Maybe even faster than they're supposed to. And also the Dublin City representatives yesterday, or today, that told us about the various different things that happen to show where somebody should go and how long that takes. I think it was 3 weeks they mentioned that it actually takes, the whole process. So that broad step, I think, is it seemed to me to be, initial assessment seemed to me to be associated with the alerting and the placing, and that it sort of shades into the diagnostic, so that there's a certain amount of diagnosis going on at initial assessment, the initial assessment stage, but somewhere along the line the initial assessment stops and the continuous assessment goes on. So that's really reinforcing the idea that the two speakers, earlier speakers, suggested that it really is a process that goes on over a period of time near the beginning, and that first step of diagnosing learning needs and goals is a broad step where there are different things that go on. So then we've got formative assessment, which Janet already talked about, and then we've got summative, where the kind of assessment that we're very familiar with and driven by, indeed, to some extent, the accreditation of looking for evidence of learning and achievement with a view to accreditation. So it's a certain kind of evidence, and therefore the kind of processes and the kind of things that we have to get the learner to do might not coincide exactly with what the learner may need to do. They may, but they may not. There may be other things that the learner would need to do in their real lives that are not identical to what they would need to do for accreditation. And then there's evaluation, which is the system level, where the assessment is actually to show us, or to show the funders or the department what is happening, the kind of data gathering that Mary talked about at the end of the process. And I was interested in the fact that Mary said that there are certain areas where there isn't enough data, or indeed any data generated, for example, in the area of the wider areas of learning. And I thought that was really interesting, because in our literacy work and in other works with community groups and so on, you often hear about people. I mean, I've heard, for example, community employment supervisors and people in your own situation being very sad that outcomes that are really significant for the learner and for the group and for the centre don't actually show up anywhere on evaluations. Because, well, why? Maybe because they're not written down, or maybe because it's not that they're not assessed, but they're not assessed systematically in a way that can be captured and that can therefore show up in the next Deloitte and Touche evaluation. You don't ever see, and I've read, for example, evaluations of community employment programmes, you don't see Deloitte and Touche saying people on CE improve their confidence. Although yourselves, the City of Dublin and the City of Galway have obviously highlighted that confidence is this doesn't necessarily mean, although it might mean that the person's inner self has improved their confidence, but on a very basic level, their confidence in doing whatever they need to do, in picking up a form in the doctors or whatever, their confidence in doing that has or has not improved. That might be the only progress, but it could be the most significant aspect of progress. But you don't see the KPMG evaluations and so on mentioning that. And maybe we are partly responsible for that, because we haven't got a systematic way. Maybe we don't value our own professional judgments enough, as J. Derek mentioned. So I think what Kieran and what Pat and Francis spoke about earlier on actually gives us an example that shows that it is possible to capture things at different levels that can be used for evaluation. But just, I'm wondering, does what happen at this stage, what we choose to assess at the very early stages, does that have a knock-on effect as to what's valued at the later stages? And if so, maybe we need to think about how we can give more status to the wider dimensions of learning than simply the technicalities. So in terms of assessment tools, what we've been talking about in the groups yesterday to a large extent was actually what do we do and how do we do it and what do we use to do it? And one of the things that came across for me is the fact that there are lots and lots of different tools out there, that they're not all useful for doing everything, all of the things that we've just mentioned, that some of them are useful for some things. It's not to say that that each is only useful for one thing, but that we have to be clear that not everything is good for everything. So that being clear as to what our purpose is, which kind of initial assessment are we talking about, which stage, might help us to clarify what kind of tools and supports will be helpful. Now, the kind of tools and supports that's on this slide are the kind of things that I thought of when Jay yesterday talked about the technocratic system level stuff that we can sometimes be driven by. And when we say assessment tools and supports, the kind of thing that I think of is like descriptions of levels, maybe a curriculum or a qualification, guidelines, individual learner plans, anything that's kind of that's kind of like an object, or that's something there that we can reference and that can be a help, but sometimes, as we know from the impact of assessment on learning, it can actually be the opposite as well. So I think that Jay's focus yesterday was on how can we get beyond that, and yes, certainly how can we get beyond that, but maybe we need to be able to use these things as well, because they're not going to go away. We have to live with them. So is there a way that we can use these without being boxed in, using them as a scaffold to the process rather than a cage and a prison to box us in? So those whatever tools we use, and it's like any good craftsperson tells us that if we're going to start a job, whether it's tiling the bathroom or making a pair of curtains, making sure that we've got the right tools for the job. A lesson I have learned the hard way, not having the right tools for the job. But in terms of assessment, what are the processes in assessment that the tools are going to support? And just these are some of the things, listening to what was happening yesterday and in the groups and today, that it seemed to me that the actual method of assessment, what do people actually do when assessment is going on? What does the learner do? Are they reading? Are they writing? Are they speaking? Are they walking around? Are they making something? Then how is that interpreted? What are they doing? And this is what comes down to our professional judgments. You look at what's happening, you read what the person has written, you listen to what they're saying, and on the basis of that, you're filtering all this, and you're using your many years of experience, like the pilot that had his 20 odd years of experience that enabled him to land the plane. You're using all that information to make a judgment, and therefore evidence is being generated. And hopefully, somewhere along the line, this is recorded in some format, either written down or some other way. So just in terms of the tools can help us with these processes. And in the next session, when the formal feedback from your work yesterday is being given, that you'll get some more pointers on your own conclusions on that. But just to highlight some of the assessment methods that came up in the last couple of days and that we heard about yesterday and today, I'm not going to read all of those because, as Pat rightly said, you can see them for yourself. But it just strikes me that going back to the type of assessment things, that whether it's alerting, placing, summative and so on, it seems obvious to me that not all of these are good for all of those things. And that, for example, there was some discussion earlier on today about the assessment of soft skills and confidence and things like that. Well, obviously, a test of phonics is not going to tell us anything about that. So we have to ask ourselves, what are the ways of doing that? Well, things like maybe written work isn't going to do much, but things like project work, group work, the kind of experiential group work, those little group work games, they're not little games, like trust games, running around, watching people in action. Those kind of activities, observing those kind of activities can give us a lot of information about people's progress on the soft skills. And I know that that's what's being done. I know that the City of Dublin and that Kieran, as they described it, they're using those kind of methods to generate evidence of those kind of gains. Now, obviously, we want to assess the hard skills, and that's what we tend to concentrate on. These tests, the first of them, I think, we're not saying that they're not, we don't want to say that any test or any method of assessment is no good. There are some of them that have a limited use, and I think that when we're looking back at the tools for the job, being clear on what that use is. For example, there was a time, and I used to be a learning support teacher a long time ago, so there was a time when tests of reading ages might have been useful. Maybe that time is over. Maybe we've moved on, and that tests of reading ages, maybe we don't find them so useful anymore in the current the demands of the 21st century. Maybe our tests of word recognition and so on, maybe they have a place in a limited sort of way, but as a kind of as a holistic approach to any kind of initial assessment, maybe they also are rather limited. That's not to say that there's any kind of method that is not useful, but just going back to the beginning about matching the job and finding the right tools for the job. So this is some work that was done yesterday in the groups, and I know that you've already reflected on this, and maybe this is something when we're working on what happens next, to do some more analysis on this. What exactly are the strengths and weaknesses of the different processes. Derek really put his finger on it yesterday, I think, when he talked about making professional judgments in a very messy situation, the swamp of adult literacy, when we are trying to make judgments about very complicated and complex ideas, where there actually often isn't a right or a wrong answer. There are a number of options, and you choose from which we have to choose. We have some tools that sometimes make us feel boxed in, but maybe we can make use of them in a way that, I think Janet referred to earlier on, balancing structure and flexibility, so that we need some structure maybe. And, I think when the CDVC talked about having their system-wide framework, but within that they were actually doing what the learner wanted to do. So finding ways of using the tools but going beyond them. And again, giving status to our professional judgments, that when we say that somebody has their confidence has improved, their way of approaching literacy has improved, I think one of the difficulties with recording and with getting status for the wider dimensions of learning is that it can easily be dismissed, our judgments can easily be dismissed as anecdotal, fluffy, candy floss, just a hunch or intuition, and therefore not worthy of serious consideration. But the kind of indicators that Kieran talked about earlier on, about the indicators of improvement in confidence, there's an infinite number of indicators that we are processing all the time. We're doing it already when we say that this person's whole attitude to literacy has changed, and that's not subjective. If as somebody did to me, with me in Kildare when I was working on the assessment project with the Kildare Community Training Workshop, and some of you know Kathleen Kramer, somebody said to me that this boy had improved his whole attitude, and I said, well, what do you mean? She said, well, he looks me in the eye, he doesn't go pale when I hand him a newspaper, he actually goes and gives me the newspaper, he will pick up a book. Now, that isn't subjective, that is hard evidence. But the indicators were developed, she developed indicators of confidence. They did actually devise a way of recording that and writing it down. Now, it doesn't mean that nationally you can, obviously you can't have millions and millions of those kind of things down, but you could have a section on some national evaluations saying indicators of confidence improvement, and that you are already doing this. So it's a case of finding out ways of capturing what you're already doing so that you can say, no, this isn't a hunch. This isn't something, that I'm just getting a feeling about. This is something that I know has changed, and I have got objective evidence for this, and here it is. So what counts as evidence? And when we're talking about what counts as evidence, a lot of that, again, is tied in with somebody earlier on said, I think it was Janet, was talking about what counts as achievement. So is it only that we've moved from being able to write our name and address to being able to write a thesis? Is that the measure of achievement? Or is it being able to write your name and address with the teacher helping you and being able to write your name and address when you're out in the doctor's surgery? Is that valid progress? So the problem is that a lot of the kind of progress that we want to talk about in literacy in relation to the person actually being able to use their skills in the real world is difficult to measure. And I think that we get terribly hung up on this word measure, because there's a lot of really significant learning and progress that happens that can be measured, but it can certainly be described. You're not measuring whether somebody's looked you in the eye or not, but you can say they were so cowed and beaten down that they went around with their head down, and now that person holds their head up and looks me in the eye. That is a describable indicator of progress and achievement. So that to me, that's evidence. And if somebody says, I did a reading at Mass, or I made a speech at my brother's, I was best man at my brother's wedding, and I made a speech. Now, to me, that counts as evidence. It's not going to be, we're not giving it as evidence to FETAC, it's not evidence for a court of law, but it means that the person has analysed what they could and couldn't do, and they're telling you, and that's evidence of achievement. So I think that an awful lot of what needs to be done, just listening to what was happening in the groups yesterday, is already being done. Obviously not everything, but they're in pockets in different places. That there's a lot of the kind of thing that Mary has been talking about, what is required to give more information and to be more systematic, that a lot of it's already happening. And that there even are tools out there, as she said, that are experimenting with trying to capture that. So it really is a case of making use of people's judgments, of the things that are there already, the learner's judgment, events that are actually happening, and particularly finding ways of using the signposts instead of experiencing them as, and when I say the signposts, I mean things like FETAC modules and national frameworks and so on. Okay, they are, they can be a prison, but they might also, in certain ways, be able to be used as a scaffold. And a lot of, to some extent, this comes down to the recording process, that we don't want to be dominated by it. But we do want to have some kind of basis from which, if we're going to talk about, let's say, somebody's improvement in confidence or somebody's improvement in writing, then clearly we have to have somewhere for them to begin a baseline. And also to clarify what needs to happen next. And other people have spoken at length at this. Really providing evidence of soft outcomes is really, I think, a way to give status to our own professional judgments that have maybe hitherto not been given treated with the seriousness which they deserve. And what we're talking about here really is only the map. The terrain is what we do on the ground, and that finding ways of assessing it and finding ways of actually putting it down for our own scrutiny, the learner's scrutiny, and for the scrutiny of others is really only the map. So that's basically it. Okay, thanks.